It's 1957, a farmhouse kitchen in rural Ohio. The bacon hits the cast iron at 7 in the morning, and the smell reaches the front porch before the screen door swings shut. That wasn't nostalgia then, and it isn't nostalgia now. There are 25 documented, measurable reasons food tasted fundamentally different in the 1950s, and most of them were quietly taken away from us. Lard. Not vegetable shortening, not canola oil, not a blend of 6 partially hydrogenated fats nobody can pronounce. Lard rendered from pastured pigs was the dominant cooking fat in American kitchens through the 1950s. It has a smoke point of 370 degrees Fahrenheit, carries fat-soluble flavor compounds deep into whatever you're cooking, and produces a crust on fried chicken that vegetable oil simply cannot replicate. The shift away from it was driven by a marketing campaign, not science. Real butter. In 1950, the average American consumed 8.5 pounds of butter per year. By 1975, margarine had taken over, and that number had been cut nearly in half. Butter contains diacetyl, a compound responsible for its deep, nutty richness. Margarine is hydrogenated vegetable oil colored yellow. They are not the same substance, and anyone who cooked through both eras will tell you they are not the same food. Cast iron cookware does something no modern non-stick pan can. It retains heat with absolute evenness, and when seasoned over years of use, becomes almost chemically bonded to the flavors of everything ever cooked in it. The Maillard reaction, the browning that creates hundreds of flavor compounds on the surface of meat, requires sustained high heat. Cast iron delivers it. A Teflon pan does not. The family skillet passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter carried decades of flavor with it. Whole milk, not 2%, not skim, not oat. The fat in whole milk carries flavor. It carries the fat-soluble vitamins. It carries the sense of satiety that makes a glass of milk feel like part of a meal rather than flavored water. The push to strip fat from dairy began in the 1960s and accelerated through the 70s. What remained after the fat was removed was a thinner, blander product that required fortification just to put back what had been taken out. In 1950, most American chickens spent their lives outdoors. They moved, they scratched, they ate bugs and grass and varied feed. The ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in their meat was roughly 2-to-1. Today's factory-raised chicken averages 20-to-1. That fat ratio isn't just a health statistic. It changes the flavor, the texture, and the depth of the meat in ways that are measurable in a lab and obvious to anyone who has tasted both. Topsoil in America has been losing mineral density for over a century. A USDA study comparing vegetables grown in 1950 versus 1999 found measurable declines in calcium, iron, phosphorus, and riboflavin. A tomato grown in mineral-rich soil absorbs those minerals, and they change its flavor, its acidity, its complexity. The tomatoes in your grandparents' garden weren't just fresher. They were grown in fundamentally different ground. Hens that roam outdoors and eat a varied diet produce eggs with yolks that are deep orange, almost amber. The color comes from carotenoids in the grass and insects they eat. Those same carotenoids contribute to a richer, more complex egg flavor. A factory egg yolk is pale yellow, the color of a hen that never saw sunlight. It is not the same ingredient. When 1950s recipes call for eggs, they are calling for a fundamentally different product than what fills most cartons today. Slow cooking breaks down connective tissue into gelatin. It allows flavors to develop through hours of low, gentle heat that rapid, high-heat methods physically cannot replicate. A pot roast that braised in a Dutch oven for 4 hours on a 1950s stovetop built flavor compounds that a pressure cooker or microwave cannot produce in any amount of time. Speed is the enemy of depth. The entire culinary shift toward fast cooking destroyed something that took time to build. Gas and wood fire produce infrared radiation that penetrates food differently than the resistive heat of an electric coil. The Maillard reaction on a gas flame is faster and more controllable. A wood fire imparts volatile compounds, phenols and guaiacols, that embed themselves in the surface of meat and bread. Electric coils produce uniform, flat, characterless heat. Most American homes in the 1950s cooked on gas. The shift to electric was a trade of flavor for convenience. Preservatives do not taste like nothing. Sodium benzoate has a slight bitterness. BHA and BHT leave a faint chemical aftertaste. Sorbic acid alters the perceived freshness of bread crusts. In 1950, the average American ate almost no synthetic preservatives because almost no food contained them. Fresh bread went stale in 2 days because it had no choice. That perishability wasn't a flaw. It was proof that the product was real. Stone ground flour retains the germ and bran of the wheat berry. It is milled slowly at low temperatures so the natural oils in the germ don't oxidize. Modern roller-milled white flour strips out the germ entirely for shelf stability. What's left is mostly starch. The stone ground flour in a 1950s farmhouse bread had a nutty, weedy complexity that enriched flour cannot replicate. The government mandated enrichment because stripping the wheat of its nutrients had become a public health problem. Ethylene gas is used to turn green tomatoes red during transport. It triggers the color change without triggering the full ripening process. The sugars don't develop, the acids don't balance. The cell walls stay firm for shipping. A vine-ripened tomato has to be eaten within days of picking. That inconvenience was not a problem in 1950 because most Americans grew tomatoes or bought them from someone who did. A tomato that traveled 2,000 miles to your plate is a different object entirely. Real vanilla extract is made by macerating vanilla beans in alcohol. It contains over 250 flavor compounds. Imitation vanilla is almost entirely vanillin, a single synthetic compound derived from wood pulp or petrochemicals. For decades, the price difference was trivial because vanilla was widely grown and affordable. Imitation became dominant not because it tasted the same, but because it was cheaper, and consumers gradually forgot what real vanilla tasted like. That forgetting took exactly 1 generation. Pork fat in pie crust creates a flakiness that vegetable shortening approximates but never achieves. The fat crystals in lard are larger than those in shortening, creating distinct laminated layers when worked into flour. The flavor of lard is also subtly savory, which offsets the sweetness of fruit pies in a way that creates complexity. Crisco entered American kitchens through advertising campaigns that positioned vegetable shortening as modern and hygienic. The pie crust was a casualty. Homemade stock is collagen, gelatin, marrow, and hours of extracted mineral flavor from bones that would otherwise be discarded. A bouillon cube is salt, MSG, and dehydrated vegetable powder. The difference isn't subtle. Soups made from scratch stock have a body, a roundness, a depth that no amount of commercial broth can replicate. In 1950, nearly every American household made stock weekly, a practice sustained by the simple fact that whole animals came from the butcher and nothing was wasted. Salt added during cooking dissolves into the cellular structure of the food. It draws out moisture, concentrates flavor, and changes the chemistry of proteins as they cook. Salt added at the table sits on the surface and is perceived only as saltiness, not integrated flavor. 1950s recipes routinely called for salting every component at every stage. The modern tendency to salt only at the end, driven partly by health messaging, produces technically less salty food that ironically tastes flatter and often gets more salt added anyway. High fructose corn syrup is sweeter than sucrose at equivalent concentrations, but metabolized differently and perceived differently on the palate. It has a clinging, one-dimensional sweetness that lingers rather than punctuates. Cane sugar's sweetness hits and fades cleanly. HFCS was introduced into processed foods in the early 1970s and became dominant by the early 1980s, primarily because corn was cheaper to subsidize than sugar cane. What changed on your palate wasn't your preferences. It was the ingredient. The apples sold in most American supermarkets today are Red Delicious, Gala, Fuji, and Honeycrisp, varieties selected primarily for appearance, shelf life, and shipping durability. In the 1950s, American orchards grew hundreds of heirloom varieties, many of them tart, complex, and deeply aromatic in ways that modern commercial apples are not. The Baldwin, the Northern Spy, the Roxbury Russet, these varieties were complex enough to eat and nearly impossible to find today. What replaced them was prettier and lasted longer. It also tasted like styrofoam. In inland American towns in the 1950s, fresh fish from the coast was still a luxury or a rarity. But coastal communities ate fish pulled from the water within 24 hours. The difference between fresh caught and commercially frozen fish isn't merely freshness. Freezing ruptures cell walls, alters texture, and oxidizes delicate fatty acids that are the primary source of fish flavor. The practice of freezing fish at sea and shipping it nationally made fish available everywhere and mediocre almost everywhere. A 1950s butcher ground hamburger to order, often in front of the customer, from cuts chosen that morning. The fat content was visible, the freshness was guaranteed by the grind date, and the meat was cooked within hours. Pre-packaged ground beef in a supermarket may have been ground days earlier, blended from dozens of different animals across multiple processing facilities, and treated with carbon monoxide to maintain the appearance of freshness. The burger tasted better in 1957 because it was a fundamentally different product. Ultra-pasteurization heats cream to 280 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 to 4 seconds to extend shelf life to 60 days or more. At that temperature, the proteins and sugars in cream undergo Maillard reactions and the flavor changes. Regular pasteurized cream has a clean, sweet dairy richness. Ultra-pasteurized cream has a faint cooked, almost metallic edge. In 1950, nearly all cream was minimally pasteurized and used within days of purchase. The shelf stability of modern cream is an engineering achievement that came at a flavor cost. Box cake mix was introduced to American households in the late 1940s and marketed aggressively through the 1950s. But most home bakers didn't fully embrace it until the 1960s and 70s. A scratch cake made with real butter, fresh eggs, whole milk, and stone-ground flour produces a crumb structure, a richness, and a flavor that boxed mixes engineered to approximate but never match. The texture of a from-scratch birthday cake is structurally different, and that structure is part of why it tasted the way it did. A slow overnight rise in bread gives yeast time to produce not just carbon dioxide for lift, but also organic acids, esters, and alcohols that become the complex flavor of a real loaf. Commercial speed proofers heat and humidify dough to cut rise time from 12 hours to 2. The bread comes out with the same volume, but a fraction of the flavor development. Wonder Bread, introduced in 1921, was the beginning of this compromise. By the 1970s, industrial speed-proofed bread had become the national standard. A cast-iron skillet doesn't just conduct heat, it accumulates history. Every batch of bacon, every cornbread, every seared steak polymerizes a thin layer of fat into the iron's surface. Over years, this seasoning becomes a complex matrix of carbonized fats that functions as a non-stick coating and, more importantly, as a flavor library. A skillet used daily for 20 years is not the same cooking surface as a brand new pan. The grandmother who cooked Sunday dinner in her mother's skillet was using a tool that had been building flavor since before she was born. Serving food immediately after cooking isn't a preference, it's chemistry. Aromatic compounds begin evaporating the moment cooking stops. Fats oxidize, starches retrograde. A pot roast reheated the next day is a different dish than the pot roast served at 6 o'clock when the family sat down together. The 1950s American household ate at a fixed time, together, as a condition of daily life. That ritual wasn't sentimental. It was the reason the food tasted the way it did. 25 reasons, not one of them complicated, not one of them requiring a degree in food science to understand. Lard, real butter, whole milk, cast iron, fresh ingredients, and time. The question isn't whether the food tasted better. It did, and the evidence is documented. The question is whether any of it is recoverable. Some of it is right now at your local farmer's market or in your own kitchen. The rest of it requires decisions about food systems that haven't been made yet. Start with the cast iron.